Untapped opportunities for EMRs in informatics and oncology, provider reluctance over tool adoption, payer impact on technology implementation. How do the hopes and projections for oncology informatics compare against the practical reality? And what new value can providers and manufacturers derive out of current solutions? Join us to find out. In the Know starts now. Hello and welcome to In the Know, your source for insight and analysis on the issues that matter to our dynamic healthcare market. I'm your host, Gina Clark. Today we look at new opportunities for data in the oncology market among the provider, manufacturer, and payer communities. We will separate fact from fiction to create a realistic picture of what clinical and operational value exists today. And we will talk about the hurdles that currently hinder broader benefits. Joining us to offer their thoughts on this are Mark Johnson, President of ION Solutions, and Jeff Forringer, President of IntrinsiQ. Thanks to you both for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having me.
When it comes to electronic medical records and informatics tools in oncology, there seems to be more than a fair amount of smoke and mirrors. What are some of the common misconceptions in this area that you'd like to dispel, both for the physicians and the manufacturers? Let's start on the provider side, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Gina. I think several sort of misconceptions in the area. One is the rate of adoption. Less than 25% of the community-based oncologists that we currently do business with today actually have a functioning electronic medical record in their practice. Fewer yet even have those linked to their practice management system. And so what we find is there's this quest for data, this need for information, but the practice really hasn't connected all of the moving parts in their offices yet that make that data available. Secondarily, the issue around definitions and the fact that there's no sort of common set of definitions with regard to a treatment regimen, a pathway, what you might call a particular stage of care, and a link back to, again, things that the payer might require. And so what we have is a very fragmented situation where there are lots of data elements, but no real story to be told today because they're not all connected.
Jeff, what about manufacturers?
They have a similar myth. They think that an EMR is one thing, not several things like Mark mentioned, a practice management system, a CPOE. They think the data inside it is nice and clean and easy to use and has all their answers, and none of those things are accurate. So they think they have the perfect answer, but it isn't there in any one system.
Realistically speaking then, what opportunities exist today for this type of technology?
Well, I think a number of opportunities exist in terms of as meaningful use gets rolled out and incentives are put in place for practices to actually adopt the technology. I think the ability for practices then to have access to their data, for people who need to mine that data to have access to those data elements, becomes really an interesting sort of opportunity for us. The link between all the different operating systems, though, will be absolutely critical because we need to have one source of truth in the practice with regard to clinical information, demographic information, and sort of treatment information about that particular patient. Today, those data elements can exist in 2 or 3 systems or even in a medical record, a paper medical record. And it's difficult to correlate all those data elements to come up with sort of a consistent story.
Looking down the road 12 to 24 months, how does that change the picture? What obstacles stand in the way of even more significant progress?
We need more oncology sites to have systems in place, as Mark mentioned. We need somebody that's cleaning and scrubbing that data so pharmaceutical companies can make use of it to run better clinical trials, to recruit patients for clinical trials, to do better phase 4 studies, to create better programs for doctors to help patients.
Other thoughts, Mark?
Well, I think, again, as we take a look at sort of the meaningful use and the economic incentives that are being put in place today, we'll see greater adoption. Organizations like ION Solutions really are beginning to put solutions available to the practices that are less expensive and actually cost-effective for the smaller practices. When you take a look at adoption of technology, really it's today only the larger practices, the more sophisticated practices have been able to afford the real full-scale EMRs. And so it's our opportunity to ultimately help develop solutions that are less costly, but at the same time deliver the necessary data elements to the practice and ultimately to the manufacturer.
Why do you think many physicians remain reluctant to use clinical workflow and informatics tools? What do you think would be the key to gaining greater physician adoption?
There's a lot of uncertainty for the physicians. Their financial uncertainty, their reimbursement is declining. When you're uncertain about your financial future, it's hard to make a decision. And they are very busy, right? They're working 12 hours a day to take care of patients. It takes a long time to put in a good, effective system. So they need partners that are going to help them do that.
And today, the solutions that are available don't necessarily fit the office practice flow. And so what you find is there's workarounds, there's sort of additional work that's required to populate these electronic systems that are different than what the practice would normally do during the course of a business day. And as Jeff said, the physicians are busy, their staff is busy, they really don't have time for extra steps. And so what we find is if we can eliminate those extra steps, the opportunity for adoption is ultimately greater. But the solution is not evident today.
So, speaking of solutions, what solutions exist for oncology practices that currently use a non-oncology EMR?
The only one that I'm aware of is IntelliDose, the product made by IntrinsiQ. It was designed to fit practices that needed a more robust electronic medical record system. Somebody that's in a multi-specialty practice, perhaps a hospital, somebody that's going to acquire various other specialties. So the oncology component can be plugged in to what they've already spent their money on.
We hear quite a few projections on how a broad adoption of these tools across physicians and pharma will impact patient care and pharmaceutical product development. But what about currently? What results are being produced on the physician and the pharma side with today's level of implementation? Once again, Mark, let's start on the provider side.
Well, I think it's a frustrating landscape for everybody today because people want the information. They think that with the adoption of some of these tools, it's going to be available. The tools today produce a very limited set of data. And if we take a look at really sort of what is coming down the road and what will be required of these practices, it really is sort of the ability to manage and identify the total cost of cancer care. The focus today seems to be on drugs only. The buy and bill and the margins are shrinking rather dramatically. But when you take a look at what even changing pathways, substituting for generics for brands, ultimately means to the payer, the savings are minuscule. It really is going back and figuring out how to manage the total cost of care, a holistic view of that particular patient, whether it be emergency room visits, other diagnostics with regard to imaging or laboratory tests, as well as avoiding unnecessary hospitalizations. And when we can begin to have that kind of a complete picture, based upon the data that's available in the practice, then both the payer, the manufacturer, and the provider will be seeing meaningful results that they'll be able to actually take action with regard to the data that they're able to analyze.
So Jeff, what about manufacturers? How can practice-specific data on practice treatment patterns be used by manufacturers today?
Well, historically, manufacturers have gotten their information through doing primary research with physicians. And physicians remember some of what they did. They remember the ideal answer for certain cases, but they can't quantify what they've done. And they don't remember the details of everything that they've done. So pharmaceutical companies are just now learning to look into these EMR records and really be able to quantify how doctors really practice. And they're seeing a difference between what doctors say they do and what they really do. And they need to figure out how to market to those differences.
So where do payers fit into the mix? What opportunities exist for stronger collaboration around the way treatment data is collected, analyzed, and used?
Well, I think payers have a great opportunity, and I think what we're seeing in the commercial space especially is that payers are now starting to realize that the unintended consequences of reducing drug reimbursement to the providers is actually driving community-based practices out of business. We see more site of service in the hospital, and so what ultimately is happening is the same care is being delivered by the same physicians, potentially, in a different site of care, and the cost to the payer is actually increasing. As a result of that, payers are now looking for creative ways to incent physicians in their office in terms of the treatment of the patient, whether it be through a pathway program, whether it be through a generic substitution, where generic reimbursement rates mirror the margin on branded products, or whether, like with UnitedHealthcare, an episode of care payment. And so we see a great deal of interest from payers today to take a look at alternative reimbursement scenarios. I think what we can safely say is no one has hit on the exact right answer yet. There's lots of experimenting, lots of information, some of it not even accurate, that's out there with regard to the success of particular programs. But at least payers now are starting to realize that they have a role to play in terms of appropriately reimbursing the community-based oncologists to keep the oncology care in the community office, which generally produces a better clinical outcome, is more convenient for the patient, and is less expensive for the payer.
I think their role is to be a disseminator of information. Right now, EMR systems that work well benefit a practice individually, but nobody's taking that information and coordinating it, sharing that back with the providers. So payers have an opportunity to explain to people what best practices are, where you're getting better outcomes in the real world, and I think they can create a community learning process that'll benefit both the quality of care and the cost of care.
So Mark and Jeff, how do external factors like reduced reimbursement and healthcare reform factor into the perceived need for clinical workflow and informatics tools? And what application might they have toward issues like comparative effectiveness?
Well, again, if you take a look at sort of a clinical approach, there's no one right answer today. There's lots of approved guidelines. There's lots of variability in the way that practices approach or treat their patients. So what we have to do is be able to not only monitor sort of the pathways of treatment, be able to record those, make sure that they are compliant with those pathways, both prospectively and retrospectively, but at the same time, monitor the outcomes. And so that's really the missing piece today, is that we can keep someone on a pathway. We understand if they've treated a patient according to a treatment regimen that they've agreed with the payer that they will treat, but we don't always see what the ultimate clinical outcome is on the back end. And the ability to correlate treatment pathways, best practices, and best clinical outcome ultimately is the nirvana that we all seek to make sure that the dollars that are being spent most effectively.
Often with the intrinsic EMR data, we look at the physician's use of products and the patient outcome, and we find that there's places where they're treating off pathway, and the patient's doing better than they would have done on pathway. So physicians are really experienced at how to treat patients, and the knowledge that they bring and the experimentation that they do, I think that'll add to what we think are the right outcomes, what the best drug combinations are. So I hope when we get a unified system, that the comparative effectiveness allows the physicians to bring their experience to the equation as well.
And Gene, I think again an emerging trend really is around the molecular diagnostics. And if we take a look at sort of what's available today in terms of the human genome and mapping that and being able to sort of link a particular branded product back to effectively treating a cancer in a specific patient, ultimately that will have benefit. Today those tests aren't always reimbursed, and I think again as we take a look at the future, that gives us the best opportunity to identify the appropriate drug for that appropriate patient. It's not necessarily the type of cancer, the site of cancer, is what is that cancer, what is that action or mechanism in your body? And how do we make sure that the appropriate drug is used to have the best clinical impact? And so we see a bigger opportunity for molecular diagnostics as part of the normal treatment regimen within the community-based practices.
Looking ahead, what opportunities for data remain most untapped, and how do we get there from here?
I think the biggest untapped area is to bring the patient into the equation. Right now, patients get information pushed out to them through websites or handed out to them. But I think the next iteration of the EMR systems has a tool for patients to tell doctors how they're doing, to explain how they're responding to side effects, what their quality of life experiences, their activities of daily living, right? And for the physician to be able to intervene with that patient before they need to go to the hospital or ER. So I think the big data hole for me is bringing the patient into the equation.
I would say, again, the patient is an important component and often the best reporter of activity and particular treatment success. I think also the ability to link the disparate systems that exist within those practices, ensuring that there are common data elements, being able to correlate the activity across the EMR, the practice management system, ultimately potentially the dispensing cabinet. Having that sort of a one view of all that information, being able to correlate it ultimately has some benefits too.
Mark and Jeff, thank you for providing your candid insight into technologies that will be the primary drivers for oncology's future.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with another all-new webisode. Until then, if it's on your mind, it's in the know.